Howdy, folks. Today we are going to talk about MongoDB a little bit. Now, MongoDB is a very popular NoSQL database. What does that mean? It means it is not based on SQL. So before we've worked with MySQL, which was a relational database, NoSQL is kind of a blanket category of every other database that is not relational. What do I mean by relational? Well, in MySQL, we have the concept of foreign keys, right? And the concept of a strictified schema. And so relational is kind of, it codifies the ability for things to relate to each other. Non-relational databases still do kind of have concepts around that, but they're set up a little differently, so they can't really be called relational. Some pieces of how Mongo works are kind of similar to SQL, and some of the concepts are similar. For example, there's the ability to read or write or update or delete, but the way we go about that is a little different. Mongo is a document database, meaning it stores its data not as a row, but as a document, an actual JSON document, though it uses a binary format. You don't need to worry about that too much because all the libraries that we're going to use can handle that data, but the gist of it is that Mongo is very popular with JavaScript because JavaScript also works directly with JSON. So it's very easy to use them together. Well, I wouldn't say it's very easy. You don't have to translate into a language like SQL, for instance. Whereas if you want to do a query in a MySQL server, you either have to use something like SQLize or you have to type out a query in SQL yourself. Mongo does not have that requirement. Mongo does have the concept of foreign keys, but it also has the concept of subdocuments. It doesn't really have actual foreign keys, but it does have something that's kind of similar to foreign keys. On the left-hand side here, we have a list of terms in SQL, and on the right-hand side, we have a list of terms that are the equivalent in Mongo. So in SQL, we have servers, and servers are usually either the virtual machine or the physical hardware that the database server is running on. Mongo has the same thing. In SQL, we have the database, and there's multiple databases that could be running on a server. In Mongo, we have the same thing. We have databases. In SQL, we have tables, and this is where things start to differ. In Mongo, we do not have tables, we have collections. And those are kind of the equivalent of a table, but they're not really the same thing. In SQL, we have a row, so tables have various rows. In Mongo, we have documents. In SQL, we have columns, so the ID column, the name column. In Mongo, we have fields, because remember, these are documents, JSON documents. In SQL, we have the schema. In Mongo, we do not have a schema. Mongo has no schema. What does this mean? Documents within a collection do not have to have the same fields or format. So in SQL, right, we have to declare all of our columns. And we have to say, here's every column that you could possibly have, whether or not it's required, what data type it is, etc. Mongo has none of those limitations. You could have completely different items in a collection, and you could just create them on the fly with whatever data you want. There's also no defined type for a value. So if you set a user's age to a string, Mongo's going to be fine with that. It doesn't care. While this does give you a lot of flexibility, because in SQL it's actually really difficult to change your columns, in Mongo it's easy to change the data in the field, but it does mean that there's no validation either. So in SQL, if there's data in the database, you know it has to conform to the right value. So when you read that data in from the database, you don't have to really do any checking on it, unless it's like undefined versus not undefined. In Mongo, you do, because you don't know those fields exist, you don't know their values of the right data, and so it does mean that more of that responsibility goes into your code, but it also means that upgrades are a little bit quicker as well. So let's take a look at a very popular tool in Mongo called Compass. This is kind of the GUI graphical user interface for the Mongo server. So this is Compass, or MongoDB Compass. This is the equivalent of MySQL Workbench, for instance, for MongoDB. Now, you can see in here, click to modify your connection string, and there's a very complicated string in there. Unlike MySQL, Mongo does default to actually using a connection URL. Whereas when we connected with SQL to start off, we filled in the username, password, database, host fields individually. Mongo just goes with the URL because it's quicker. If you are connecting to your local database, so if you're running MongoDB on your computer and connecting on that same computer, you can just click connect. Even you could leave this field blank and it will default to your local install. You can see like there. Now you can see I am connected to that server. There are some databases. You may see some databases existing already. Again, this is similar to MySQL. These are just kind of housekeeping databases that Mongo itself needs to keep track of various things, like admin. Presumably, those are the admins on the server or various admin data. Configuration for the server. Again, just like SQL, MySQL did the same thing. So we can create a database. Let's call it a testDB. And they want us to start off creating a collection for it as well. So I'm just going to call this collection 1. I'm going to ignore these for now. Create database. And then you can see there's my test database with 1 collection. Now you can see a collection. This is similar to list of tables in SQL. And I have 0 documents in it and 1 index. I click on here. Now you can see some interesting stuff. I can import data from a JSON or CSV file, which is kind of nice. You can filter, and you notice that is kind of JSON-like, how it does its filter. And that's because Mongo uses JSON for a lot of its search. You can see there are actually things that analyze your schema. Again, Mongo does not enforce a schema, but it can still kind of make best guesses if you ask it to, which can be useful when we get into Mongoose, which does require a schema. So if I want to create a document, to insert document. So if you can import, like it says there, or insert. And now you can see, what is it done here? It's giving you an ID, and Mongo, every document has an ID. It's required to. So this is unlike SQL, where rows did not necessarily have to have IDs. That's because SQL had a much more deterministic way of accessing those rows. In Mongo, the ID is the only thing it's guaranteed to have in a document. I could probably delete it if I wanted to, but it's a good thing to have. And here's that data. This is insert, not permit. So if I want to add another field, let's try that out. This ID, I'm not completely sure why this is its own object. I think that might be a Mongo special thing. Anyway, because this is JSON, I have to put everything in double quotes, including the keys. 1, value 1, field 2, 5, for instance, field 3, false. So anything valid in JSON, and again, no dangling commas. JSON does not actually allow dangling commas. I can also go here, and you can see it's figured out the types for me, which is kind of nice. If I click insert, there's my document. And if I look at it, oops, that doesn't really do anything, I guess. I can edit it, change these values. I can copy it, etc., delete it. And let's add another one. Okay, we get another ID. Just put a name in here. Now notice these 2 things are in the same collection, in the same table, basically. But otherwise, they are completely different. Mongo is not enforcing any sort of schema. It doesn't care. I could add another document with field 2 and it's a string. Mongo doesn't care. It's not paying attention to that stuff. It expects us to make those changes on our own. So, well, there's also subdocuments in here. We'll get to those. But for now, let's take a look at how to actually utilize this in our Node servers. All right, so here we are. I have a very simple Node server set up, or Express server. It doesn't really do anything right now. If we want to use Mongo, similar to when we were connecting to MySQL, we needed the MySQL 2 module. For Mongo, we need the MongoDB module. So let's go ahead and install that. Mongo, either npm, pnpm, or yarn install MongoDB. And actually, I'm going to install .env at the same time, just because that'll be useful. Give that a minute to run through. Okay. Then we import it. MongoDB require MongoDB. So when we're making a connection, okay, we need to actually use something on MongoDB called the Mongo client. So instead of just saying new MongoDB, etc., what we're going to do is we're going to say MongoDB.MongoClient.connect. And this takes in a connection string. So what does that connection string look like? Well, it starts off with MongoDB as the protocol. So this is similar to any other URI. The protocol comes first, colon, 2 slashes, and then localhost. We may need to do 127001. We'll see. The port for Mongo, the default port is 27017. That is going to be the default port. And then the name of your database. Now here's a fun thing about Mongo. I've created my test DB, right? Let's do another name here. We're going to call this user DB. Okay. Now, this database doesn't exist. Mongo's cool with that. Mongo will automatically create that database as soon as we try to access it. So I'm going to put this in here, connection string. Then options. So we've got some options that we want to pass into Mongo. There's 2 options that are important. Use new URL parser. Now, what is this? So Mongo, the Mongo client has had an update to its URL parser recently. And it was kind of a bit of a breaking change. So they gated it behind this flag. If you're using an older system that was using an older version or expected an older version of the URL parser, it's not going to force update you to that. But in our case, we do want it because it's going to give us a warning if we're not using this flag. And that's to encourage older programs to update. That's just kind of how it's set up. The other one we want is use unified topology. Now, what's that? Well, there's 3 kinds of Mongo servers. There's standalone servers, there's shared servers, and then there's, I forget the third one. But basically, the original version of the Mongo client handled them all differently. Again, they've updated that recently so that you can handle them all the same way, and that's what this flag does. This says, hey, it doesn't matter what kind of server I'm connected to, use this newer system that knows how to handle them all the same without having to do a bunch of stuff. All right, the third parameter. So yeah, there's 3 parameters here. Oops. Is the callback function. Similar to SQLize, we use a callback function here. Mongo, I believe, does have a promise library. So if you want, you could probably use that as well. But for the callback, there's 2 parameters. One is the error, and the other is the client. So obviously, if there's an error, well, then something went wrong. So we probably want to log that. Console.error, right? Otherwise, this is not the actual way that we can access our database yet. No, it is not. Equals client.db. Why is it set up this way? I don't know. But that's how the library works. It's not uncommon for libraries to have strange things like this. So this client, we can't make queries on this, but we can make queries on this specific DB. It might be so that you can make multiple database connections, not completely sure. Anyway, only once this database has been created do we actually want to listen here. Why are we moving that in here? Well, if we start listening immediately, we haven't made the connection to our database. This is similar to MySQL, where we want to make sure our database connection is complete before we actually start listening on the app. So that's kind of important for us to do. We're not going to do anything with this right now, but there are a couple other ways that you could structure this so that this database is available to other pieces of your program. For now, we're just going to hold it there and then listen. All right, so let's say npm start. All right, thinks about it. That something went wrong. It couldn't connect. So you know what that probably is. Let's try. Now you can see the value there. Imagine if our app had come up and our app.listen had fired and people start making API calls, but the database didn't come up. Okay, so after about 10 minutes of debugging this, I have figured out the issue. For some reason, this particular version of MongoDB will not connect. So if I change this to 4.5, I believe it's 4.5.0, run my install again, or yeah, I already installed it. Then you can see, and I run start, it connects immediately. So if you're running into issues with that, try seeing if this version of MongoDB works for you rather than version 5, since it seems like there might be a couple of issues there. It did eventually, even if the server was shut off, it did eventually time out, but it took quite a bit of time. Anyway, the rest of this is completely fine though. So that's all we're going to go over for now. Since this is getting a little long, but next time we'll talk about some of the more common operations and how to do those within the database, within your server. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, and I'll see you all next time.